Did Jesus believe in a historical Adam? That's actually a really interesting question, not only because I think it helps us to think better about the Bible's relationship with history, but also because I think it does help us to understand Jesus' purpose, his teaching, what the incarnation is really all about. I want to react to a video that was put out by William Lane Craig. He's talking about Jesus' interaction with the character of Adam. Let's take a listen to what he says here.
The question here would be whether Jesus might simply be referring to the literary Adam, that figure that features in the stories of Genesis 2 and 3, rather than speaking of a historical individual. And I think that's certainly very possible.
Okay, so first of all, this is a great start. It is true that when we have stories that have been gathered and collected by communities and passed down to us, they take on more than just a historical meaning to them. They take on a collective community meaning. They are essentially mythologies that have truth embedded in them that we interact with. And when we interact with those stories, we don't constantly talk about how they are mythological. We talk about them within that mythological category. This is how we use metaphor. Whenever we use a metaphor, we don't constantly remind you, by the way, I'm speaking metaphorically here. We speak in the language of that metaphor, and we understand from the conversation, from the language game that we're all participating in, that this is the way that I'm speaking. We're doing this all the time, regularly in all of our lives. I mentioned this in the book Upside Down Apocalypse when I talk about how the apocalyptic genre uses metaphor. When we use images like eagles and bears, we can be speaking about the actual physical animals in the world. We can be talking about the football teams and the competition that they're having. We can be using those animals to represent countries like the United States and Russia. We don't actually explain what we're doing when we're speaking metaphorically because it takes you out of the metaphor and it defeats the purpose of using a metaphor. Same thing with our shared stories, same thing with our mythologies. When Jesus is talking about Adam, it is very likely that he's speaking in the language of the community that he participates in. Craig is on point here.
We can refer to literary figures without committing ourselves to their historicity.
Exactly.
Having said that, however, it does seem to me very plausible that Jesus of Nazareth believed that Adam, the Adam in the literary story, did exist.
So again, I think he is very right. When we have mythologies, which are our histories, gathered together and made larger than life and passed down to us, we do accept them in a particular way. There's no reason to think that Jesus would not have accepted those mythologies on the terms that first century communities would have. Yes, they probably understood that Adam and Eve, as they were presented in Genesis, was not a literal, objective retelling of the story, but they also had no reason to reject the idea that they were actual characters that came to them through their history. Same thing with the way that Jewish peoples in the first century would have thought about Abraham or Moses. Of course, they were aware that the Moses of literature was not equal to the Moses of history. This was a hagiography in some sense. But of course, they still believed that Moses was, at some point, a historical character that gave birth to these stories and these hagiographies. Same thing with Adam and Eve. It's very likely that Jesus absolutely did believe in Adam and Eve as historical characters, even if he understood that their stories were stylized. Their stories were stripped down to the bare essentials to convey the meaning and the importance of these stories over time through oral tradition to him. Again, I'm very much on point here with Lane Craig. It's actually probably in the interaction of these two different ideas. Jesus understands Adam and Eve as literary characters that have come down through the community of the Jewish people, and they were likely historical characters that pre-existed at some point and were passed down. That all makes sense to me. Here's where I think he goes off the rails a little bit.
And therefore, even if his teaching doesn't imply the existence of a historical Adam, I think the fact that Jesus believed that Adam was a historical person would entail that Adam is historical, because as a divine being, Jesus must be omniscient and therefore cannot hold any false beliefs. Then I think that does commit someone who believes in the deity of Christ to the historicity of Adam.
So this is just a misunderstanding of what incarnation is all about. Incarnation is the Christian idea that Jesus is the divine God born into the human story, and that somehow Jesus is this mysterious union of human and divine. That does not mean that Jesus retains all of what it means to be God before the incarnation. Jesus is not omniscient. He says as much himself. In Matthew, he says that the hour of the Son's second coming is not known to anyone, even including to Jesus. He does not know when this is going to happen. Luke says that Jesus grows in wisdom. So Jesus is not born into the manger as a tiny little baby understanding the universe. That is not a category that we can apply to the incarnation and still maintain that Jesus is human. There is no reason to think that Jesus understood advanced calculus. That would not have been part of his education. He did not understand string theory or particle physics. There's no reason to think that Jesus understood the age of the earth and the way that geology works and that mountains were formed over millions of years. These things don't make sense for a human being to just instinctively know. These are things that take compiled human knowledge over time, compounding on itself, being handed down to us. Now, that doesn't mean that Jesus was less smart than us. In fact, that doesn't mean that people in the first century were less smart than us. In fact, our brains have changed very little evolutionarily. We are not any smarter than other hominids. We have compounded human knowledge that has been put into reserve and then given to us, and we have been taught that knowledge. We're not smarter than them. That is a chronocentric view that believes we are smart because of the point in history that we are born in. No. So Jesus is just as smart as us, but he only has the collected wisdom that has been gathered to that point and handed to him. Incarnation means that Jesus is God expressed in human story. So Jesus understands God completely because Jesus is God. Jesus can communicate that in the terms that make sense to his community, his culture, his upbringing, the world that surrounds him, and we can trust that implicitly, perfectly even. This is the Christian conviction that Jesus reveals God to us completely, at least in the sense of everything that we need to know. There are still mysteries about God. There are things about God we will never fully understand until we meet God, but everything we need to know about God within the realm of the human experience has been revealed to us in Jesus. Jesus does not come to reveal to us the age of the earth, the nature of geology, the nature of biology. Jesus is revealing to us God, and he does that perfectly. So to say that because Jesus is God means therefore he cannot hold any false ideas. That's true in the sense of the divine. Jesus doesn't believe any wrong things about God because Jesus is God, come to reveal God. But of course, Jesus grows in the wisdom and stature of the culture that surrounds him, and that culture is a product of the compounded knowledge that has led up to that point in history. We, you and I, right now, understand more about our physical scientific world than Jesus did. That does nothing to diminish the incarnation. In fact, if Jesus were to know all of these things from his birth, from his incarnation in the world, it would take away from his humanity. Christian tradition does not force us to believe that Jesus reveals history or science to us as well. That is not the point of the incarnation. And when we go down that road, it forces us into all kinds of misreadings of Scripture that will take us away from faith in the 21st century. Now, if you're interested in listening to a little bit more about the difference between inspiration and inerrancy in the Scriptures and why we point ourselves to Jesus when it comes to understanding them, we've got a video on our channel. You can find the link in the corner up here. But if you made it this far in the video, thanks for that. Hit a like, hit subscribe, keep tracking with us here on the channel, and we will see you back here soon.